Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you want to hear more episodes, please help me cover the costs of production. Become a patron of the show for just $2 a month. Go to the website and click the patron button, foreigncountries.podbean.com. Whenever I've taught early medieval archaeology, I've always struggled with Scotland, Pictland in particular, because of the real scarcity of sites. It's a much under-researched area. So I'm delighted now to welcome Professor Gordon Noble. As a team from Aberdeen, Glasgow and Chester, they have been researching the Pictish archaeology of the Rhynie Valley, most recently published in the Medieval Archaeology Journal. So welcome, Gordon. Archaeological evidence for the Pictish period in Scotland is pretty scant, but you've been working in this area for a good decade now. So what is the volume of the material?
I guess this paper was a culmination of many years of work, really stretching back at least to 2011, but actually probably really 2005 and 6 when we started working in the Rhynie landscape. But in terms of the more general background, I guess, is looking at Pictish archaeology. So the Picts were first mentioned in late Roman sources in the 3rd century, and they go on to become a whole series of powerful kingdoms across northeast Scotland, basically from the Firth of Forth, just to the north of modern-day Edinburgh, up to the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, across the Western Isles, as far as we know. But really the main problem, I guess, is that we have very little, both in way of historical records for the Picts, which are almost exclusively external sources. So we have Anglo-Saxon sources talking about the Picts, we have Irish sources talking about the Picts, and before that, classical sources referring to Pictish society. We only really have one native series of documents, and that's a list of kings with some extras added in there. So we have very little historical knowledge of the Picts, even though they were such a fundamental part of Scotland's history in terms of being the first documented kingships at least, and contemporaries with Anglo-Saxons and the Irish. And then on the archaeological side is a complete or a real dearth of archaeological sites. So, if you look at early medieval Ireland, for example, you have 40 to 60,000 early medieval ring forts, an incredibly densely documented, excavated settlement landscape. Likewise with Anglo-Saxon England, you've got hundreds of settlement sites, elite timber hall sites, cemeteries with thousands of burials in some cases. If you compare that to Pictland, then you're dealing with, literally a handful of settlement sites known in the lowlands at least, and Rhynie is a lowland settlement. And in terms of other elements of archaeology, you have probably around about a dozen hill forts known from this time period, fewer than that actually dated. And then in terms of cemetery sites, there is a growing record now in terms of aerial reconnaissance and crop marks of barrow cemeteries. But again, in terms of number of excavated examples, you're dealing with dozens, if that, in terms of human skeletons from Pictish graves. So really, it was coming to this situation in terms of how can we maximize our understanding of the Picts through archaeological approaches, and how can we identify the sites in the first place? So that was really the kind of background to our work at Rhynie.
And this includes those carved stones at Rhynie.
All we knew at that stage was that there was a whole series of Pictish stones in the Rhynie landscape. And so these are carved stone monuments that date from at least the 5th century AD through to the probably 9th century AD. And they're one of the kind of enigmatic or mysterious elements of the Pict symbolic system on the stones. They almost look like Egyptian hieroglyphs in terms of you have abstract symbols and you have objects as well. So, what on earth is this symbolic system? What does it mean? And that was one of the things we were trying to approach through our work at Rhynie. It's a landscape with 8 of these symbol stones known, which is a real concentration. And there was one actually still in situ, which is very rare for this time period. And that's located just to the south of the modern village of Rhynie in western Aberdeenshire. The in situ stone is known as the Crawstane, and it's got a salmon and what's known as a Pictish beast who looks like, a cross between a dolphin and an elephant. So it's got these 2 symbols on the stone, and what is that stone doing there? What was the context of that stone? In the late 1970s, there was quite a remarkable find in Rhynie. The farmer ploughed up another Pictish stone known as the Rhynie man. And this has got not quite full length, but a large human-like figure carved on the stone. But I say human-like because he's got big pointy teeth and a huge nose, and he's carrying this axe over his shoulder. It's really quite a startling image. It was ploughed up by the farmer only a few meters away from that in situ stone, the Crosstane. And then in the same year, he ploughed up another Pictish stone on a little hillock on the old routeway that leads through this landscape. And then in the same year, so regional archaeologists, Ian Shepherd and Ian Ralston, who was at the University of Aberdeen at the time, did some aerial reconnaissance around Rhynie, and they spotted these crop mark enclosures around about the in situ stone, a series of circular enclosures that seem to include a palisade and 2 ditches.
So what did you set out to do first off?
So our early work, going back to 2005 and 6, was when I just finished my PhD and I was working with MEGGEN GONDEK, who's an early medieval archaeologist. And my PhD was on prehistoric archaeology. But I actually trained as an undergraduate art historian, and we did a course on the Picts and Pictish art. And I was really fascinated by this. And I almost went and did my PhD on Pictish stones with Martin Carver. But then I got deflected into prehistoric archaeology. So basically, this was like a sideline project for me in terms of let's try and understand why are all these Pictish stones in this landscape and what can we say about the stones? Because they've very much been, or largely approached from an art historical perspective. You know, what do these symbols mean? How do they compare to manuscript art? But, you know, in terms of surveying this landscape, what might it tell us?
What did you find?
We very quickly found that the in situ stone was actually standing at entrance to a whole series of enclosures that date to the 5th, 6th century AD. So slap bang in the middle of the Pictish period. And it's turned out to be a very high status settlement. And so we have material indicators of that, things like wine and oil amphora, beware or late Roman amphora sherds turning up the site. This is the first time in the whole of Pictland this material has been found. And it tends to turn up on documented royal sites in Ireland, and it also turns up in places like, you know, famous places like Tintagel in southwest England. So it's these kind of post-Roman networks that are bringing this material to the Irish Sea in particular, and as I say, this first time in the whole of Pictland this material has been found. And then we found things like Anglo-Saxon glass from Western France, and this turned out to be a huge metalworking centre as well. So we've got hundreds of metalworking molds, crucibles, ingot molds.
Okay, so new material was being uncovered that vastly expanded the corpus. What was your methodological approach to this region?
So in terms of methodology for the site, as I say, I come from a prehistoric background where we were doing large open area excavations, and that's the sort of thing that hadn't really been done on a very regular basis on Pictish sites, with the exception of Martin Carver's work up at Port Mahomet, which was an early Christian monastery of the Picts. You know, that was an inspiration to our work. But in terms of, you know, the secular sites, previous work had only ever done keyhole trenches, the work of Leslie Alcock, for example, which was fantastic in terms of, you know, he looked at some of the few documented Pictish sites and put small keyhole trenches in and got basic dating evidence for things like the handful of hill forts we know from Pictland of this date. So what we were doing is at Rhynie was really trying to be more ambitious in terms of our fieldwork strategy. So we started off transcribing the existing aerial photographs of the site. Really the best ones have been taken in the 70s. And we followed up with large-scale geophysics, magnetometry in particular, looking at the whole field in which the complex is situated, and finding lots of other archaeology in that field as well. And then in terms of excavation, it was big open area strip and map. So we basically, over 5 field seasons, we exposed almost the entire complex of enclosures and settlement inside. That kind of approach allowed us to identify ground plans of buildings, midden areas, metalworking areas. So it was much more successful, I think, in terms of actually understanding what's actually inside one of these elite sites of Pictland. As I said in the introduction, there's very few Pictish settlements known. We had almost no ground plans of Pictish buildings, or very few, from the lowlands. And so now we've begun to increase that data set through these kind of approaches.
And how did that develop for the wider landscape?
There are 3 hill forts actually overlooking the lowland complex at Rhynie. We've done small-scale excavation at all 3, trying to put that wider landscape story together. 2 of them actually turned out to be early medieval Pictish in date as well. And the largest one is Tappa North, and it's this huge hill fort that overlooks the Rhynie Valley. And this is something we don't talk much about in the article because we've really only done this work since it was published. But there we were using things like LiDAR survey to map this hill fort. And it's quite an extraordinary hill fort. It's got something like 800 house platforms on the hill, and it's enclosed by a lower rampart. There's actually an Iron Age, so perhaps almost 1,000 years earlier, on top of the hill. But lower down, there's a lower rampart that encloses 16 hectares, which is Scotland's second largest hill fort. And it encloses all these hut platforms. So with LiDAR survey, we were able to increase the number from measure survey that had been done in the 90s and 80s. It showed a couple of hundred of these house platforms, and we increased that number to about 800 through GIS analysis and slope and hillshade models, and also using photogrammetry via the drone as well. And since the work was published in 2019, we found, as I say, that hill fort is also early medieval in date, 5th, 6th century. So that's been just a revolution in terms of, understanding this landscape and realizing the significance of it, to go overnight from a Pictish archaeology with a few dozen, if you're being generous, houses and sites, to hill fort with potentially 800 of these platforms. And that's the beauty of all these emerging technologies in terms of drone survey and LiDAR survey, in terms of revealing that wider landscape significance and allowing us to, again, identify and target and characterize these Pictish sites that have always been very difficult to get a handle on.
So you've got 3 main locations. There's Tappa North and Bar Flat, and the third one is...
Yeah, there's a third site, which again we only briefly mentioned in the article, called Cairmore, and that's a kind of little ring fort that overlooks the Rhynie Valley. So all the Bar Flat or the Crossdane enclosures are down in the valley. Tappa North and Cairmore kind of overlook this valley. So we've gone from not having any confirmed settlement sites of the Pictish state in this landscape to having 3 major sites, which again is just a real revolution, for want of a better word, in terms of beginning to identify a major central complex, I guess, of polyfocal centre with all these different sites of the same date within this one landscape.
So what constitutes these sites? Because I think they're all connected, but they're all very different, aren't they?
At the Crossdane complex, it's an enclosed site. So it's not a hill fort in terms of not in an elevated position. It is on a kind of small knoll. And that was enclosed in an early stage with ditches and probably ramparts. It's all been ploughed flat over centuries or millennia of ploughing. And then in a later phase, it had a timber palisade, which is quite a remarkable enclosure. It was about 1.5 meters deep, and we could actually see the impressions of oak planks and big posts defining this outer boundary. The Crossdane stands at the entranceway to these enclosures, and we also found another stone socket for another standing stone. So it might have been for the Rhynie man, or one of the other Pictish stones known from the landscape. So they seem to be almost performing an architectural function in terms of marking the entranceway into this high status complex. So that's exciting in terms of generally Pictish stones are thought to mark burials or just be marking boundaries in the landscape, but to actually see them as part of a settlement complex puts a totally different spin on it. And also helps you date these monuments, because we could date the stone socket, and we also, during the excavation of the settlement, we found objects. For example, a miniature iron axe pin that looks exactly like the axe that the Rhynie man carries. So again, we can't date the stones, but we can date the objects and the midden layers and the houses inside the settlement. We did that, and we now have something like 50 radiocarbon dates.
So what kind of dates did you get?
It's the most boring ox-cal plot you've ever seen, because they're all 4th to mid-6th century. It's a site that lasted maybe 100, 150 years. And, it wasn't a site reused after the 6th century. So we've got this amazing snapshot of what was probably a pre-Christian complex. The northern Picts seem to only be Christianized in the 6th century. So it really gives us, quite startling insight into Pictish power centres of that kind of late Roman Iron Age, 5th, 6th century context, which in terms of, early medieval archaeology in Britain more generally is actually, the real dark age in terms of we have a very poor understanding of what settlement or elite centres in Anglo-Saxon England, for example, looked like in that time period. And then there's all the metalworking evidence, and it just, again, provides a window into a period we knew very little about in terms of artifact styles. We're able to show that, certain brooch types, certain pin types are much earlier than we thought, again, providing, great sequences for that. So that's the Crossdale complex, and we have all these imports as well, amphora coming from Mediterranean, glass from Western France, glass from Anglo-Saxon England. So it's this amazing centre that's clearly drawing in all these resources, but also producing material on a big quantity, presumably for redistribution to clients, the followers of the kings and elites that are likely to be living at this complex.
So how does Tappanoth relate to that?
And then Tappanoth, we had no idea, we had no thoughts that this would be early medieval in date at all. It's this very large hill fort, as I say, and it's quite a marginal location, and it's its first site in Aberdeenshire often to get snow on its top, for example. Not somewhere you'd want to live today necessarily. For that reason, it was always thought to be perhaps Bronze Age in date when the climate was a bit better. And so all these people living on this hill slopes made more sense. We were simply excavating there, I must admit, really just to put the larger landscape story together in terms of how this landscape was developing through time. But we dug the first platforms on the hill in 2019, and we began to get Roman period objects, so Roman pottery, and we had metalworking evidence again from these platforms. So we thought, well, there's definitely a later use of this hill. And then we got the radiocarbon dates back for the rampart and for the platforms, and the rampart dates were 5th, 6th century, so exactly contemporary with the Crossdale enclosure down below. And this rampart goes on for about 1.5 kilometres, and it's this huge stone bank with a timber palisade on top. So a huge amount of labour going into constructing that. And then, as I say, this encloses up to 800 or more houses in there. So we're just beginning to get our head around, how do we interpret this site? Is it some sort of seasonal assembly site for people gathering when the king and his followers are in court down in the lowlands? Or is it actually, the key to this landscape in terms of, this is a permanent settlement developing through time, and this gives almost of an urban type scale? Does that give rise to the royal centre down in the lowlands? That's another possibility.
And Cairn Moor?
And then finally, there's this other small hill fort on the other side of the valley, Cairn Moor. And this we've now dated to the 5th to 7th century AD. So again, it's directly overlapping in date with the Crossdale complex, Tappanoth, but also goes slightly later into the 7th century. And this seems to be a more everyday settlement in terms of there's no Pictish stones from the site. We haven't found a huge amount in terms of material culture, but even then it's still a huge investment in labour. So we found 2 stone banks, and both of those banks are revetted by huge timber posts every 2 metres around the circumference of this monument. So again, you can see there's huge investment in materials and resources in this site. So we suspect this might be, a dependent settlement on the royal centre down in the lowlands. But these are all the issues we're trying to grapple with in terms of, interpreting this, huge data set now. We've gone from knowing that there were Pictish stones in this landscape, and, there were a whole series of undated enclosures and hill forts, to actually realising this is a hugely significant Pictish landscape with, multiple sites and foci within that landscape.
Yeah, you're asking a lot of questions of this landscape now. So what can you say now that you couldn't say a decade ago?
Well, I think, 10 years ago, we had this landscape that had 8 Pictish stones in it. there was suggestions that some of these picture stones might be marking graves. And we did actually find that. That's not something I mentioned, but there is actually a contemporary cemetery right next to the village, or probably underneath the village largely. Yeah, I think we can just, really have a dramatically different picture of this landscape and understand the context of those picture stones much more. So there's a group of picture stones that seem to relate to this elite complex at the Crossstane. Some of them standing at entranceway into these high status enclosures with timber buildings inside. And we can see the connections that Picts had. They had connections to the Mediterranean. We had no idea these long distance trading connections actually extended into Pictland. I'd say this first time we found late Roman amphora, for example, in Pictland. We can also see that the Picts were hugely productive metal workers. We have a whole series of new artifact types we had no idea about, and in terms of metalwork typologies across Britain and Ireland, this is going to have a big impact, I think, in terms of understanding the development of insular styles of artifact. And then in terms of the wider landscape, just really for the first time realizing that we're not just dealing with a single site here, we're dealing with a complex of different sites. Now the challenge is to interpret that. So as I say, there's a whole series of possibilities. Is tapping off a seasonal assembly site? Is it a more permanent site? Which we're leaning towards at the moment.
You're talking about year-round use.
The amount of labour that's gone into constructing all these platforms, they're actually dug into the hill slope and the huge rampart roundabout. Maybe we need to entirely change our model of the complexity of society in this period in terms of, is this a big centralized settlement that must be being supported by a larger population, is a challenging site to live. So it must be, if it is permanent settlement, it must be being supported by tribute and resourcing from that wider landscape. Yeah, there's much wider implications. And before that, the largest Pictish site we knew of was Burgh Head, which is a promontory fort we've been working on, which is about 5 hectares in extent, and Tapanoff is 16 hectares. And there's nothing like it known in Ireland or Western Britain. It's far larger than Tintagel, for example. And I've never been so surprised by a series of radiocarbon dates before in terms of the dating of that lower enclosure at Tapanoff. We're still scratching our heads in terms of trying to interpret all this. But that's a really fun and exciting place to be in terms of Pictish archaeology being the poor man's archaeology of early medieval Britain and Ireland, to actually being, at the forefront of new ideas and new findings is exciting. But, having said that, we are still, light years behind other regions in terms of number of settlements and the like. But that's something we're trying to address through other projects in other parts of Pictland, which I'll have to talk to you about another time, maybe.
Yeah, you're calling these people Picts. How do you visualize this group of people and their identity?
We touch upon this in the article in terms of there's been quite a lot of revisionist thinking about the Picts from the historical side in recent years, suggesting that it was really only in the 7th century that Pictish identity really emerged. Prior to that, the word Picts was just a nickname given by the Romans and was just describing a whole series of disparate groups that didn't really have much political or social cohesion until the 7th century. In the 7th century, there's a rise of a very powerful king, Brythé, who defeats Anglo-Saxon king Egfrith in the Battle of Nectansmere in AD 685. And that seems to give rise to this particularly powerful over-kingship called Fortrue, which is located in northern Pictland. So yeah, there have been a lot of thinking suggesting that there wasn't much in the way of cohesion or development of more cohesive groups in Pictland until that 7th century context. So again, this entirely contrasts to that perspective in terms of if you have this site, which clearly is some sort of royal site in this 4th to 6th century context, and then you have this major population centre, whether it's seasonal or permanent at Tapanoff, you're talking about a scale of society that we really just hadn't thought about at all for Pictland in that time period. So I think the archaeology will probably lead to new historical revisions of reconsidering that historical transition from, the small scale groups recorded by the Romans to, the larger groups. Certainly, even in the Roman period, the fact that they are referring to the Picts in that later period does seem to replace a whole series of more localized tribal groups, or whatever you want to call them. So the historical sources did actually give hints that there was some sort of political consolidation in that late Roman period. And yeah, I think the archaeology is beginning very much to agree with that. So yeah, exciting times ahead.
Yeah, so this is a long-term developing project. Where are you going with it next?
I think it's a hugely exciting time. I remember when I was starting to think about PhD ideas, I think there were people who suggested, no, don't go and do a PhD on the Picts or their symbols, because therein madness lies, because what you're going to find that's new, and in terms of archaeology, there isn't very much out there. So yeah, just don't bother. But now there's lots of PhD students, including a whole series at Aberdeen, who are studying the Picts and various elements of Pictish archaeology. And I'm external advisor on PhD projects in America and Canada now as well. So we're beginning to get more international interest in the Picts and what they can contribute to early medieval archaeology. And we do have a lack of historical sources. We do have a lack of settlements, but we do have amazing elements of Pictish archaeology, like the carved stones, not only the symbol stones, but the Christianized cross slabs, where you get amazing scenes of Pictish elite culture, hunting scenes, everyday scenes, warriors, which you don't really get elsewhere in early medieval Britain and Ireland, or not to the same extent. So there's amazing iconographic evidence that the Picts can supply. And if you combine that with well-dated stratified sequences, then I think you're onto a real winner, really. So in terms of, what are we doing next? Well, we've been working on Pictish archaeology now for 10 years. And a few years back, we got a big grant from the Leverhulme Trust for a project called Comparative Kingship, which is continuing our work at Rhynie, but also working on new sites like a Burgh Head, which is a huge Pictish promontory fort that dates from the 6th century through to the 10th century. So it's actually that kind of later Pictish period. This should tell us about, the transition in the 10th century, for example, when the Pictish identity disappears, what happens in that kind of Viking age to the Picts. What we've been doing is lots of keyhole excavations on a whole series of sites, because it still is quite hard to identify Pictish sites. What does a Pictish hill fort look like? We don't really know. So we excavate lots of potential candidates, and maybe 10% might be of that date. And, we pursue some of those with more in-depth study. We've been working on early Christian sites. We found a huge ecclesiastical vallum at a site called Kinedder, which looks very, very similar to the famous site of Iona. And that's in the center of northern Pictland. It was a site that had huge amounts of sculpture. We're also looking at sites in southern Pictland now, nuclear hill forts, going further north as well. So yeah, we're just trying to be very ambitious in terms of our fieldwork program, getting our students involved in that as well. Hopefully we can keep getting the funding that allows us to do these kind of things, and that's always the challenge, isn't it, in archaeology?
Oh yeah, so how is the multidisciplinary approach important in this research?
Our current project is working with a whole series of different disciplinary expertise. So we've got Nick Evans, who's a historian of the Picts. He's looking at early medieval elite culture from a comparative perspective. How did Pictish kingship compare to Irish kingship or Anglo-Saxon kingship? Got a paleoenvironmentalist, Samantha Jones, who's looking at what was the environmental signature of places like Rhynie. How did the landscape change through time? And we're working with Derek Hamilton on Bayesian modeling, which is quite amazing. For example, working on archive material from previously excavated sites, and actually being able to show that some of these hill forts actually only last for a generation or 2 generations at most. They're clearly kind of boom and bust centers of power, which is really exciting, because you can then begin to relate these much shorter chronologies now, possible through things like Bayesian, to historical events recorded in Irish annals or the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. So yeah, that's exciting in terms of being able to have this kind of interdisciplinary focus on the Picts. And one thing I didn't mention about Rhynie is place name, which seems to come from the early Celtic word "re" for king, which is, a great clue as to what's going on there. So again, we've been working with place name specialists like Simon Taylor to identify other potential candidates that we can fire our archaeological lasers at to try and understand more.
And is Pictish archaeology finally in vogue now?
In terms of the wider discipline, it's great. There's loads going on. Glasgow just published their work for TVET. Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust has been working on King's Seat at Dunkeld, which seems to be a major royal centre as well. Community groups in Fife working on early medieval forts. So yeah, it's an incredibly vibrant time for Pictish archaeology, probably the most vibrant it's ever been. So yeah, long may that continue.
Before we finish, let's just plug your social media.
If anyone's interested in the project, they can follow us on Facebook. It's Northern Picts, Picts, and we post, when we're excavating, daily updates on our excavations, and we've got a Twitter account as well, which is Northern Picts. So that's probably the best way to keep up with the latest progress. And we usually post when we have new publications out on those sites. So yeah, check them out, it'd be great.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me today, Gordon Noble. All the papers we've talked about today are detailed on the website. And please help to cover the costs of production by becoming a patron of the show. Go to the website and click the patron button. foreigncountries.podbean.com. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.